What happens when a rich man, blinded by arrogance, tries to humiliate his maid in front of his wealthy guests? He forces her to play the piano, expecting laughter, but instead, her hidden talent leaves everyone stunned and changes her life forever. This is a story of dignity, resilience, and a shocking twist that no one saw coming. Welcome to Brainfuel, the place where powerful stories come alive, stories that inspire, entertain, and leave you thinking long after they end. If you love meaningful tales with life-changing lessons, you're in the right place. Let's begin. Play something for us, Maid. The words cut through the air like a whip, followed by the loud laughter of wealthy guests. Crystal glasses clinked, golden chandeliers shimmered, and the grand living room of Mr. Harrison's mansion was filled with chatter, music, and arrogance. At the center of it all sat Mr. Edward Harrison, a man of immense wealth but very little kindness. His mansion was the pride of the city, a place where the rich gathered to flaunt their fortunes and sneer at those beneath them. Harrison, with his sharp tuxedo, slick-back hair, and smug grin, loved being the center of attention. He thrived on humiliating others, especially his servants, for the amusement of his equally shallow friends. That evening, the mansion was alive with music, chatter, and the arrogance of privilege. A lavish dinner had just concluded, and guests lounged on velvet sofas, sipping expensive wine imported from Europe. The air smelled of roasted meat, perfumes, and cigar smoke. Laughter echoed against the marble walls as conversations swirled about politics, business deals, and gossip about the less fortunate. In the corner of the room stood Clara, the maid. She wore a plain black dress with a white apron, her hair neatly tied back, her eyes lowered as she quietly collected empty glasses and plates. Clara was a black maid in a world where her very presence was often dismissed as invisible, until it became the source of someone's cruelty. Mr. Harrison noticed her standing there, quiet and reserved. His lips curled into a wicked smile. He always enjoyed finding ways to turn his servants into the evening's entertainment. It was his form of sport. Raising his glass, he called out loudly, making sure everyone heard. "Clara, come here." The chatter quieted slightly as all eyes turned to the maid. Clara paused, her heart thumping, and stepped forward, hands clasped nervously in front of her apron. "Yes, sir," she said softly. Harrison's eyes gleamed with mischief. He pointed dramatically toward the glossy black grand piano that sat near the center of the room. It was an elegant instrument, imported at great cost, more of a decoration than a tool of music. "Why don't you play us something?" he said with a smirk. "Surely a maid like you must know how to keep her masters entertained." The room erupted with laughter. Guests slapped their knees, some even spilling their wine as they chuckled at the ridiculous suggestion. A few whispered cruel remarks. "A maid at a piano? This should be amusing. Does she even know what the keys are called? Perhaps she'll bang it like a child." Clara's stomach twisted in knots. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood frozen. She wasn't just being asked to play. She was being forced into a performance meant only to humiliate her. She could feel the mocking stares, the cruel chuckles, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on her. She wanted to say no. She wanted to whisper, "I can't." But in the world she lived in, refusal was not an option. To say no to Mr. Harrison in front of his guests would be seen as disrespect, and disrespect could cost her more than just her job. It could cost her survival. Her breath grew shallow. Inside her chest, her heart beat faster and faster, like a drum echoing through her entire body. Mr. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his smirk widening. He could already imagine the scene. Clara stumbling over the keys, producing awkward, broken sounds, while his guests howled with laughter at her expense. It would be yet another story for him to boast about later. "Do you remember the night I made my maid play the piano? She sounded like a cat falling down the stairs." But Clara's silence stretched on. For a moment, the laughter began to die down as the room waited for her response. "Well," Harrison said, his voice sharp now, carrying a hint of command. "Don't keep us waiting, girl. Sit down and play." Clara's throat felt dry. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the shadows and escape the cruel spotlight forced upon her. But she knew she had no choice. Slowly, she bowed her head and whispered, "Yes, sir." A murmur swept through the guests as she walked toward the piano. Some grinned with anticipation. Others whispered behind their hands, ready for the embarrassment that was sure to come. One woman leaned toward her husband and said, "This will be the highlight of the night." Clara's footsteps echoed softly against the polished floor as she approached the instrument. The piano loomed before her like a giant, its glossy surface reflecting the glittering chandelier above. She had not touched one in years, not since her childhood. As she reached the bench, her trembling hands brushed against the polished wood. She could feel the weight of every stair piercing her back. Slowly, she lowered herself onto the seat. Behind her, the guests chuckled again, sipping their wine, ready to laugh at the spectacle. Mr. Harrison, sipping his drink with satisfaction, leaned toward his friends and muttered loudly enough for Clara to hear, "This should be good. Let's see what talent our little maid has hidden." Clara closed her eyes for just a second. In that moment, memories rushed back. Memories of her father sitting by her side when she was a child, gently guiding her small fingers across the keys of an old church piano. Memories of nights when she snuck into the church after cleaning, practicing alone, letting the music be her escape from hardship. But tonight was different. Tonight, she wasn't playing for herself. She was being mocked, forced into a stage she never asked for. Still, she placed her fingers on the keys. The room went silent, waiting for her humiliation. And as she sat there, heart pounding, a fire lit within her. A mix of fear, pain, and something stronger, something that whispered, "Show them who you are." The silence in the room was heavy, almost suffocating. Every eye was fixed on Clara as she sat at the grand piano, her fingers hovering above the keys. To the wealthy guests, this was nothing more than a cruel game. They expected wrong notes, clumsy hands, and a wave of laughter at her expense. But inside Clara's heart, another world stirred, a world none of them knew existed. Clara had a secret, one she had carried for years. She was not just a maid. She was not just someone who swept floors, polished silver, and bowed her head in silence. She was someone who once dreamed. When Clara was a little girl, her father had been her greatest inspiration. He was a humble man, working odd jobs to keep food on the table. But he loved music with a passion that words could never capture. He often told her, "Music is a language, Clara. It speaks when words cannot. It heals when nothing else will." Her father managed to get an old, slightly broken piano from a church that no longer used it. Many of its keys were chipped, and some were out of tune, but to young Clara, it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She would sit beside her father for hours as he played gentle hymns and simple melodies. Slowly, patiently, he taught her how to press each key, how to feel the rhythm, how to let her heart speak through her fingertips. Those lessons became the happiest memories of her childhood. But life was never kind for long. When Clara was still young, her father passed away suddenly, leaving her and her mother to survive alone. Her mother took on endless work as a laundress, while Clara, barely a teenager, found herself scrubbing floors, cleaning houses, and later, working as a maid in wealthy homes. The piano lessons ended, but the music never left her. Every time she walked past a church and heard hymns, every time she caught the faint sound of a piano from a wealthy home, her heart would ache with longing. And whenever she could, she returned to that broken church piano, practicing quietly in the evenings when no one was watching. Music was her secret escape. It was the one place where she wasn't a servant, where she wasn't judged for her skin or her clothes. At the piano, she was free, but she never told anyone. Who would believe her? Who would care that a maid had talent? The world she lived in did not value her dreams. It only valued her silence and obedience. And so, she locked that part of herself away, burying it under years of labor and humility. Now, sitting at the grand piano in Harrison's mansion, all of those memories surged back. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Music speaks when words cannot. Her hands trembled as she rested them gently on the keys. The polished ivory felt smooth and unfamiliar compared to the rough, chipped keys of the old church piano. It had been years since she played anything more than a few scattered notes, and fear clawed at her heart. What if she failed? What if the notes stumbled? The laughter would be unbearable, sharper than any whip. Behind her, she heard the muffled giggles of the guests. One man muttered, "This is going to be dreadful." A woman whispered to her friend, "She'll embarrass herself within seconds." Clara closed her eyes, shutting out their voices. She could almost hear her father again, guiding her, reminding her that music was not about impressing others. It was about telling her truth. She drew in a deep, shaky breath. Then, slowly, she pressed the first key. The soft note rang out delicate but clear. The sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, echoing in the silence of the room. For Clara, that single note was like opening a locked door inside her heart. Her fingers began to move again, hesitant at first, then with more confidence. She searched her memory, recalling melodies she once practiced in the church. The piano responded, its rich, warm tones filling the room. The laughter began to die down. The whispers quieted. Guests leaned forward, surprised that she could even form a tune. But Clara wasn't playing for them. She wasn't even thinking about them. She was playing for herself, for her father, for the little girl who once dreamed of making music. Every note carried years of hidden pain, silent endurance, and unspoken hope. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm as her fingers danced across the keys. She was no longer the maid in a stiff black dress. She was the girl who used to believe in dreams, the girl who found comfort in sound when the world was too heavy. The room transformed. What began as mockery was shifting into something else. Guests who expected clumsy noise now found themselves staring in awe. The melody carried emotion, depth, and skill they never imagined could come from servant. Even Mr. Harrison, who had leaned back smugly with his drink, felt the smirk slipping from his face. He shifted in his seat, his brows furrowed. This wasn't the humiliation he had planned. Instead of making her a fool, she was making him look like one. But Clara didn't notice. Her world was the piano now. The music rose and fell, sometimes soft and gentle, sometimes strong and commanding. It was as if her soul had been locked away for years and was finally being released in a storm of sound. She could feel tears welling in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. She poured every ounce of her strength, her sorrow, her resilience into the performance. This was her hidden talent, her hidden truth. And tonight, whether they liked it or not, the world was about to hear it. The first notes floated into the air like whispers of a forgotten dream. Soft, gentle, yet impossibly clear, Clara's fingers glided across the keys, weaving a melody that seemed to hush every corner of the grand mansion. For a moment, the guests did not know how to react. They had expected chaos, noise, and a maid fumbling like a child. Instead, what they heard was music, real music, alive, soulful, and heartbreakingly beautiful. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Glasses were lowered slowly onto tables. Even the waiters who were moving quietly in the background froze, their eyes drifting toward the piano in disbelief. Clara was lost in the sound. With every note, her fear melted away, replaced by something far greater: memory, strength, and release. The polished piano responded to her touch like an old friend she had been reunited with after years of separation. She played with such emotion that the notes no longer sounded like keys being pressed. They sounded like feelings being spoken aloud. Her body swayed gently with the rhythm. Her eyes closed, shutting out the piercing stares of those who once mocked her. She wasn't in Mr. Harrison's mansion anymore. She was back in a little church where she practiced alone, where the chipped keys never stopped her from pouring her heart into the music. She was a little girl again, sitting beside her father, learning that music was a language the soul understood without words. The melody grew stronger, swelling into the air like a tide. The room that had moments before been filled with laughter and arrogance was now utterly still. The sound moved like a current, wrapping around everyone, slipping past their defenses, pulling at something deep inside them. A guest near the back blinked rapidly, as if trying to hide the tears forming in her eyes. Another guest leaned forward in his seat, his lips parted in astonishment. Couples glanced at each other, their smirks replaced with awe. It was as though Clara had stolen the very air from the room and replaced it with her music. Even Mr. Harrison, who had been leaning back smugly in his chair, now sat upright. His glass of wine trembled slightly in his hand. This was not the humiliation he had promised his guests. This was something entirely different, something that made him uncomfortable. His jaw tightened as he realized the cruel joke was no longer on Clara. It was on him. But Clara was far beyond his reach now. The music carried her higher. She played not only with skill, but with pain and passion. Years of unspoken suffering were released in those notes. Every insult, every humiliation, every moment of being overlooked and underestimated, all of it poured into the melody. The piano became her voice, and her voice was unstoppable. Her fingers moved faster, gliding across the black and white keys like flowing water. The melody shifted from soft sorrow to powerful defiance. The sound filled every corner of the mansion, demanding to be heard. It was not the playing of a timid servant. It was the playing of an artist, a soul on fire, a woman who had carried her gift in silence for far too long. The guests could feel it. They could feel her story in the music, the story of struggle, of dignity, of hope that refused to die. It was as if the piano was painting pictures in their minds. A little girl learning beside her father, a young maid working tirelessly, a dream hidden in the shadows, now breaking free. One older gentleman whispered to his companion, This is no ordinary talent. Do you hear the control, the emotion? She plays as though the music lives inside her." Another guest, a woman who had sneered at Clara minutes earlier, now sat with her hand over her mouth, ashamed of the cruel words she had spoken. Even the staff, maids, butlers, and footmen, who usually moved like shadows in the background, stood in quiet pride. For once, when their own was not invisible. For once, the room was forced to see her, to hear her. The music reached its peak, building into a storm of sound that shook the hearts of everyone listening. It wasn't just beautiful, it was commanding, undeniable. The air seemed to vibrate with energy, and people leaned forward instinctively, as though afraid to miss even a single note. When Clara finally brought the piece to a gentle close, the final notes drifted like feathers into silence. The echo lingered, refusing to fade, as though the walls themselves were holding onto the sound. For a long moment, the room remained completely still. No one moved. No one breathed. It was as though time itself had stopped. Then applause. It began with a single clap, hesitant, almost disbelieving. Then another, and another, until suddenly the entire room erupted into thunderous applause. Guests rose to their feet, clapping furiously, some even shouting bravo. Others wiped tears from their eyes, unable to contain the emotions Clara's playing had stirred within them. The same people who minutes ago had laughed at her now stood in awe, humbled by the brilliance of the very woman they had mocked. Clara slowly opened her eyes, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths. She looked around the room, her gaze meeting the stunned faces of her audience. For a moment, she was overwhelmed. She had not played for recognition, only for survival. And yet here they were, applauding, cheering, honoring her. At the back of the room, Mr. Harrison remained seated, his face red with anger and embarrassment. He did not clap. His smirk was gone, replaced by a scowl. He had intended to make her the fool, but instead, he had become one in front of his wealthy peers. And Clara knew it. She did not smile, she did not gloat. She simply bowed her head humbly, her fingers still resting lightly on the piano keys. But inside, her heart swelled with something she had not felt in years, pride. The room had been transformed, and so had she. The sound of Clara's final note still seemed to float in the air, long after her fingers had lifted from the keys. For a moment, silence ruled the room. It was not the silence of mockery or boredom. It was the silence of awe. Then, like a spark igniting a fire, one pair of hands clapped. Another followed, then another. In seconds, the mansion erupted with applause so thunderous it shook the very walls. The same guests who had once smirked and whispered cruel jokes now leapt to their feet, clapping, cheering, and even whistling in admiration. A woman pressed a handkerchief to her eyes, wiping away tears she hadn't realized had fallen. A man shouted, "Bravo!" his voice cracking with genuine emotion. Clara sat still for a moment, stunned by the response. Her chest rose and fell quickly, her fingers trembling from the intensity of her playing. She had not expected this. She had not expected anything except humiliation. But now, the very people who had laughed at her minutes ago were looking at her with awe, respect, and even envy. The applause went on, filling the mansion like a storm. One man, older and dignified, stepped forward. His white hair and glasses gave him a scholarly look, and his face bore the unmistakable expression of someone who understood music far deeper than the average listener. He had been silent the entire night, quietly observing. Now, his voice carried over the clapping. "Remarkable," he said. The applause quieted slightly as the crowd turned to look at him. He moved closer to Clara, his eyes shining. "Where did you learn to play like that?" he asked gently, his tone not mocking, but filled with genuine curiosity. Clara lowered her gaze, her voice humble. I taught myself, sir. My father showed me some things when I was little. The rest, I practiced whenever I could." A murmur rippled through the guests. They could hardly believe what they were hearing. No teacher, no expensive training, just practice, stolen in moments between labor. The older man shook his head in wonder. "In all my years as a music professor, I have rarely heard playing so raw, so powerful, so filled with soul. You, young lady, possess a gift, one that cannot be taught. You were born to play." Gasps filled the room. Several guests exchanged astonished glances. Suddenly, the same woman who had whispered insults earlier now whispered to her companion. "Did you hear that? A professor says she's extraordinary." Clara's cheeks warmed. She bowed her head slightly, unsure of what to say. Compliments were foreign to her. Praise was something she had never been given, only orders, only commands. The professor turned to the crowd. "Do you not see? What we have witnessed tonight is not the fumbling of a maid. We have heard the music of an artist." Applause thundered again, louder than before. But not everyone was pleased. At the far end of the room, Mr. Harrison sat stiffly in his chair, his glass of wine untouched on the table beside him. His face was flushed, not from drink, but from humiliation. His eyes darted around the room, watching his guests shower Clara with admiration. Each clap, each cheer felt like a slap to his pride. This was not how it was supposed to go. He had meant to embarrass her, to make her small, to show his power over her. But instead, she had risen higher than anyone in that room, and he had been made the fool. A guest leaned toward him, chuckling. "Edward, you never told us you had such talent hiding in your home. Why, this maid could outplay half the musicians in the city." The words stung. Harrison forced a laugh, but it sounded hollow. "Yes, well, I suppose she's had more time on her hands than I thought," he muttered, though his clenched jaw betrayed his anger. Meanwhile, the other servants who had been standing quietly in the shadows now stood a little taller, their eyes bright with pride. For once, one of their own was being seen, not as a servant, not as invisible labor, but as someone remarkable. Clara glanced at them, and the faintest smile tugged at her lips. She knew what this moment meant, not just for her, but for all of them. The professor, still astonished, turned back to Clara. "You must not let this gift go to waste. With training, with opportunity, you could stand on the greatest stages in the world. You have something very rare, something people will pay dearly to hear." The guests murmured in agreement. Some even looked at Clara with a kind of envy, realizing that true talent was worth more than all the wealth in the room. For Clara, the words felt like a dream. She had lived her entire life being told she was nothing more than a maid, a background presence, someone who should be silent and unseen. And now, Here she was being told she was extraordinary, that she had a gift worth sharing with the world. But Clara did not bask in their praise. She lowered her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone." Her humility only made the guests admire her more. Yet as the applause roared once again, Mr. Harrison's fury deepened. His plan to mock her had not only failed, it had backfired spectacularly. His guests, who once hung on his every word, now barely glanced at him. Their attention was entirely on Clara. For the first time in his own mansion, he was no longer the center of the room. His fingers tightened into fists. His lips curled into a scowl. He wanted nothing more than to order her away, to remind everyone that she was just a servant. But he could not without looking like a bitter fool. And so he sat in silence, stewing in his humiliation, while Clara, the maid he had tried to break, sat at the piano, her dignity shining brighter than all the chandeliers in the room. The stunned reactions of that night would be remembered long after the last guest left. It was not Harrison's wealth or arrogance that people would talk about. It was Clara's music. That night marked the end of Clara's silence. The echoes of her music lingered in every corner of Mr. Harrison's mansion, long after the guests had left. What had begun as a cruel trick had turned into a revelation, one that no amount of arrogance or wealth could erase. For Clara, it was the beginning of a new life. The very next day, the music professor who had praised her returned. He was a man of influence, respected in music circles far beyond the city. His words carried weight, and he was not one to waste them. With gentle insistence, he asked Clara to meet him privately. "My dear," he said, his eyes warm with sincerity, "you cannot remain hidden here. Your gift is rare. With training and exposure, you could inspire thousands. I would be honored to mentor you." Clara's heart pounded. For so long, she had lived quietly, pushing aside her dreams just to survive. Now, standing before her was an opportunity she had never dared imagine. She hesitated. Fear gripped her. Could she really leave behind the life she knew? Could a maid, someone the world dismissed as nothing, truly rise to stand among great musicians? The professor seemed to sense her doubt. "Do not let fear steal your destiny," he said firmly. "Music belongs to all who can hear it, but only a few can give it life as you do. You owe it to yourself and to the world to share this gift." Those words stayed with Clara. Within weeks, arrangements were made. The professor took her under his wing, teaching her the techniques and disciplines of professional musicianship. For the first time, Clara played on fine instruments, not broken church pianos or dusty decorations in rich men's homes. She studied tirelessly, pouring herself into every lesson, determined not to waste the chance she had been given. The road was not easy. There were whispers, sneers, and obstacles. Some questioned whether a black woman from humble beginnings had any place on the grand stages of society. But Clara did not let their voices drown her spirit. She had faced humiliation before. She had faced cruelty. But now she had something no one could take away. Confidence born from that night when her music silenced an entire mansion. Slowly, step by step, Clara rose. She began performing in small gatherings, then larger venues. Word spread quickly. Audiences were captivated not only by her technical skill, but by the soul she poured into every piece. When Clara played, people felt something they couldn't describe. She made them weep, smile, remember, and hope. Soon, she was invited to play in theaters, concert halls, and eventually in some of the most prestigious venues across the country. Each performance was met with standing ovations, each note reaffirming what the professor had seen in her that night: greatness. Clara was no longer a maid in the shadows. She was an artist in the spotlight. And yet, through all the success, she remained humble. She never forgot the broken piano in the church, her father's gentle teachings, or the years of labor that had shaped her resilience. She carried those memories like a crown, not of gold, but of strength. Meanwhile, Mr. Harrison's story took a very different turn. Word of the infamous piano night spread far beyond his mansion. At first, he tried to laugh it off, telling people it had been all in good fun. But whispers followed him wherever he went. Guests who had once respected him now saw him in a different light, not as a powerful host, but as the man who had tried to mock a servant and instead revealed her brilliance. His humiliation grew as Clara's fame spread. He could not escape her name, her music, her story. Everywhere he went, people mentioned her performance, praising her gift, marveling at her journey. And though no one said it outright, the truth lingered in the air. Harrison had been the fool. Over time, his influence waned. His parties became less attended, his laughter less convincing. The arrogance that once defined him began to feel hollow, even to himself. He had tried to make Clara small, but in doing so, he had made her unforgettable. As for Clara, she continued to rise. Years later, she stood on the stage of a grand concert hall, the seats packed with admirers from all walks of life. The chandeliers glittered above her, but it was not wealth or status that filled the room. It was anticipation, respect, and admiration for her. She sat at the piano, her hands resting gently on the keys. For a moment, she closed her eyes and thought of her father, of the little church, of the night in the mansion when everything changed. Then she began to play. The music that filled the hall was not just sound, it was her story. The story of a maid who had been mocked, a woman who had been underestimated, a soul who refused to be silenced. Her notes carried across the room like wings, lifting the audience into a world of beauty and truth. And as the crowd rose to their feet in thunderous applause, Clara smiled, not with arrogance, but with quiet gratitude. She knew her journey had been hard, but she also knew that every moment of pain had led her here. The maid who was once mocked had become a master of music. The laughter that once tried to break her had been replaced by cheers that celebrated her. And the man who had tried to humiliate her was remembered, not as the powerful host of a mansion, but as a footnote in the story of her triumph. Clara had risen beyond mockery. She had risen into greatness.